Alright, so before we get started on the topic of the day, just want to give you a quick update on the BugOut Roll. If you haven't picked one up yet, by all means, you can show your support to the channel by going and picking up one of these unique backpacking systems. There is a 10% discount being offered throughout the month of April. This dips in significantly to my profit margins, but I'm offering it to you guys to help me get the whole campaign up and running. Some people, thank you very much, have foregone the 10% discount to support the channel, which is something I am just in awe that people would even be so considerate, and I thank you very much for your support. But I'll post a link to the website below, and you can really show your support for the channel by doing that. So if you have the dime and you have the time, go check it out. So today's video is going to be a video response to a video done by Prepper Logic. If you haven't checked out his channel yet, go and check it out. Go subscribe in mass. Certainly not a channel I see eye to eye about with every single issue, but he pulls no punches when he talks about preparedness issues. He's also a fellow Canadian, very uninhibited and unsolicited in his condemnation of what he perceives to be the shortcomings of the preparedness community. Always makes for a dramatic and entertaining video. Now, the video in question is a video called Dark Prepper Mindset: Killers Creating Killers. Now, some of you may remember a couple of years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago now, I did a video called After the Collapse, The Beast Within. It was one of the first in the After the Collapse series. It was actually the third installment. In that video, I went into a long-distance rant about how the civilities of the Western world would quickly be dissolved in the chaos of post-collapse anarchy, and essentially how everybody had a beast within them, which was just waiting for the right opportunity to be unleashed. Now, within Prepper Logic's video, he talks about how many people have the propensity to do very heinous things, and who amongst us might do those heinous things. And he cites some commonly known about social psychology experiments from Stanley Milgram and others, which talks about under the right conditions, the average person can be coaxed into doing very devious things, and things which might go against their ethics and morality, at least in the best of times. Now, I also want to tie this into some pop culture reference here. I haven't had a chance to comment much on The Walking Dead this season. I haven't really been a big fan of the second half of The Walking Dead Season 7, but I want to talk a bit about the phrase, "we are all Negan," and talk about the possible subtext of that statement. Now, when they're saying "we are all Negan," on the surface, of course, we know that that alludes to Negan's cult following, and Negan creating this almost holographic-like power structure in which there is no head of the snake. Everybody's the head of the snake. So if Negan was to be taken out, someone would take up the rank of Negan. That Negan isn't a person, but rather Negan is an ideology or a political movement or a phenomena of some sort. But I have to wonder if there's more to it that meets the eye, because if you look at the evolution of the character Rick Grimes, there was a time when he was very soft and his threshold for morality was very, very high. That is, he was very reluctant to harm anybody. He showed a lot of ethical backbone in a lot of the decisions he made, especially against the will of the character Shane, who, if you remember, was all about killing the bad guys before the bad guys killed us. Rick was never like that. Rick was always trying to negotiate, always trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. But of course, as he's evolved throughout the seasons, he has become quite the cutthroat, ruthless killer, and is arguably now doing things that far exceed the ethical threshold exhibited by Shane. I mean, Rick has become a fully fledged dictatorial killer through and through. And if you look at all Rick Grimes' enemies throughout the course of The Walking Dead, every time he takes out one of these enemies, it seems like he has to lower that ethical threshold just a little bit, and he takes on, and perhaps necessarily, some of the characteristics of the bad guy that he just killed. So one can only wonder, is there some underlying philosophical statement being made here about how we are all inevitably a Negan, in the sense that we are all inevitably a conqueror, and will see the benefit in doing ruthless things to promote what we perceive to be the greater good? There's a dilemma in philosophy called the dirty hands paradox. The issue here is that leaders might justify otherwise morally impermissible actions for the sake of some noble end. And it brings up the dilemma of, if I don't dictate, somebody else might dictate, therefore I should become a dictator. So is "we are all Negan" a statement about human nature in general, that we all want to conquer the world? We've all heard all of the songs, like "everybody wants to rule the world," Tears for Fears, Everyone's a Napoleon. That's another song, I believe it was by Annie DeFranco. There's many songs that talk about how everybody wants to conquer the world. In their own minds, everybody wants to rule the world. Most people are familiar with the concept of being drunk on power, while in many cases power is relief from anxiety. And so long as you are a living being on this world, there is going to be anxiety for your well-being. So if you are in control of that world, theoretically you would have less to fear. But of course, as history has shown us, and as we can derive from our own intuition, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even when you have gained total power, you still are going to fear the loss of that power. Then of course you get situations like North Korea where the people are heavily oppressed out of fear that they might someday try to revolt. So are we all a Negan? Now going back to Prepper Logic statement, what I want to know from you and what I would compel you to think about was, where is your moral threshold? For some people, their moral threshold is very low. You tell them to go and punch somebody over there and they'll go and do it. There are some people out there who've developed a blatant disregard for human life and decency, and while in the grips of their crystal meth addiction, go and do very heinous things. You have other people who perhaps won't do something unless they really need something. So there might be people who won't go and steal food from their neighbor in a shit hits the fan situation unless they're starving. You have others who'll be far more proactive in doing so and justify murdering and looting and pillaging people long before material scarcity would ever necessitate the act. Some people's moral threshold is incredibly high. In fact, some people, and I would expect that many people, would sacrifice themselves for the greater good. I think there are a few people amongst us here who wouldn't sacrifice themselves for the greater good of their family, or even members of the greater social circles. But even with those people whose threshold is so high that they might sacrifice themselves, if one of their loved ones' lives was perhaps on the line, what would they do then in order to protect them? There's another character in The Walking Dead, Dwight, who's basically in debt to Negan for the better part of Season 7, because Negan is basically holding his wife hostage. And so Dwight has to do basically whatever Negan says, even if that involves killing people. So Dwight kills in order to protect his family member. How many people would kill in order to protect their own family members? And when would you draw that line? Now, the point that Prepper Logic was making with the social psychological experimentation with Stanley Milgram experiments, which basically show that in some conditions, when the conditions are right, up to 90% of people will do things that probably run counter to their normal ethical thresholds if they were absolved of the responsibility. So if somebody came along and said, hey, if you shock this guy to death, we'll take full responsibility for it, and if there was enough pressure put on that person, they would capitulate and proceed to torturing that individual. Now, the Milgram experiments were an attempt to explain a lot of the atrocities that happened throughout history, and most recently, when the experiment was done, it would be close to the World War II era. So they wanted to know, how could you convince a bunch of people to basically, murder a bunch of other people? Basically what the study showed, under the right conditions, most people, the overwhelming majority of people, could be pressured into torturing someone literally to death. Now, the scariest thing, though, and something that Prepper Logic didn't really talk about, is that these experiments were very controlled. And even though there weren't a lot of ethical guidelines when these experiments were conducted, so they could pretty much do whatever they wanted for the most part, they were still arguably very tame in their depiction of the coercion that might happen in a grid down, shit hits the fan, tyrannical style leadership structure, where you have a person who literally would be pointing a gun at your head saying, you better go and do this, this, and this, or I'm going to kill your family member, I'm going to do God knows what to the people you love. So I think under those conditions then, if up to 90% of people were willing to do what Milgram asked of them under those very tame and controlled conditions, just imagine how many people would capitulate to the pressures of those coercive, tyrannical forces when there was no rule of law and when their actual own family members' survival was at stake. you can pretty much guarantee, and I can pretty much guarantee with absolution, that people will probably do almost anything to survive. And I do mean anything, and I do mean even if that means taking the life of other people. And that's just being realistic, because you need to ask yourself this, for those of you who have children, you know, how far would you be willing to go to preserve the lives of your children? And yes, indeed, some people are going to have a high enough moral structure that they would rather see their own family members perish than to go and bring hardship and suffering onto others. But when you factor in all of the other pressures of grid down survival and just the dilution of our values and our mores and our norms as a society, when those things start to dissolve and they are no longer commonly practiced, every day from that point forward, man becomes more animalistic in his behaviors, because there really is no incentive to act otherwise. So my question for you is, what is your line? What is your price? They say everybody has a breaking point. Was it Marlon Brando who said every man has a price? Maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe there isn't. You know, I hear a lot of people saying, well, I would never kill somebody, or I would never do this, and I would hope that you would never do that, and I hope you would do everything in your power to obviously act within the boundaries of the law as it is today, but also possess the integrity to live in line with your true, deepest, utmost beliefs when it comes to morality and ethics. You can get really specific with assessing your own moral threshold. You know, for me, I might struggle to see the value in giving my life up for somebody else's if I can rationalize that, well, who's going to look after my family? And of course, it matters also, who am I giving my life up for? Is it for an 80-year-old man, or is it for a mother and her 2 kids? Obviously, I'd be far more inclined, and I realize that you could logically debate this, but I would probably be inclined to sacrifice my own life for the benefit of the pregnant woman and 2 children, more so than I would the 80-year-old man. So you see, there is a threshold there of morality. Some people won't even sacrifice himself for the pregnant woman and the 2 kids because they're rationalizing that I gotta protect my own kids, which is something that if and when it happened, I would have to consider. Am I putting my family's life in jeopardy by going and trying to help somebody else? There would come a point in a full-blown societal collapse scenario where it's going to be your life or somebody else's. That's when all of the values that we collectively have worked towards over the years as a society have totally gone by the wayside, and it's cutthroat, it's dog eat dog at that point. Arguably, if it ever boiled down to that, that would be the end of humanity in the evolved sense of the word. The longer SHTF goes on, the greater the risk that we all become a Negan, that we all become a ruthless conqueror who rationalizes that it's better I do the dictating than somebody else. And a lot of people say, oh, I would never do that, I would never do that. But the thing is, the conditions have not presented themselves yet for you to test that theory. And it is just a theory. Because until you're there, until you're in that moment of truth where you have to decide whether to live in line with the beliefs that you've espoused for the better part of your life while the grid was up and while times were good, are going to be the same that you enact in a without rule of law, no holds barred, every man for himself situation. Sometimes I do a little mental exercise. It's a people watching exercise. And it's mostly with people I know, because you kind of have to know people in order to do this exercise. And I just try to think about, you know, if this person had absolutely nothing, and if they were totally desperate, if they were, you know, at the end of their rope and their family members were starving, what would this person be capable of doing? Would they do whatever it took to survive? How would they act if the shit hits the fan? And I just think about it, and then I have my little judgments about who will survive and who won't. And of course, I always keep that to myself. See, there's certain traits of your personality that haven't had to manifest in your life, but they're all there because they've been put there by evolution. There was a time, thousands and thousands of years ago, where the law of the jungle dictated who survived and who died. And it was very much a cutthroat endeavor. And those latent traits are still there, it's just that the conditions haven't been ripe to trigger them. My very elementary understanding of biology and evolution is that there are environmental conditions which elicit the response of certain genes and cause certain genes to wake up and manifest into action, if you will. The phenotypic expression of our genes is in part triggered by our environment. I'm not sure how much this concept is related to epigenetics, which are changes in an organism's genetic expression which aren't attributable to the genes themselves. So it's something in the environment that is waking up the beast within. And I absolutely guarantee you that the only reason why you exist today is because of the underlying carnal fire that burns within you. Right now we have the luxury of being sanctimonious because we're not put in the conditions that require us to make those hard decisions. So it's very easy to say, well, I would never do that. You've never been in the situation. You don't know. You literally don't know. In deprived conditions, depravity prevails. And that everybody's threshold is going to be different. But you're not going to know what your threshold is until you're put in the conditions. Because as much as you have beliefs and convictions about certain things, as the saying goes, talk is cheap. And when it comes down to the wire, when it comes down to decide whether you and yours die or someone else dies, how are you going to rationalize your actions into that belief system? Or will you just throw that belief system entirely out the window? You see, the morality issue is so huge because it's not talking about who could survive. Anyone can survive if they had absolutely no scruples whatsoever. It comes down to who should survive. There's a book written by Karen Horney, another psychoanalyst, called The Tyranny of the Should. Horney talked about the neurosis of modern man as being the result of many things that Freud talked about, with the impositions of civilization put on him. And because of this, we are tyrannized with shoulds. This is akin to what Freud called the superego. There's no better proof of this than the whole political correctness movement. And all of these expectations that society puts on us that have us restrict our true feelings of expression for the purpose of polity and progressing in our social values, as we're told. But the problem is these layers of ethical and moral expectations that we've placed on modern man are quickly going to start falling away. And the reason why is that because no matter how hard religious groups or ideological groups, political groups try to get us to accept these shoulds as facts, the reality is they are not objective facts. They are cultural creations. Everything down to you should eat cows and not dogs is a cultural creation. Now, there have been rational arguments made in terms of the sentience of various animals, but still a lot of that is very subjective when it comes down to really breaking down all the nuances of ethics and the difference between right and wrong. But they're going to be stripped free of all the shoulds. That whole neurosis will subside. And that's when it comes down to who can survive. It's not about who should survive, even though I think that it should be about who should survive. That's something, another topic into itself that doesn't get enough attention by survivalists and preppers. It's that, why should you survive? What is it that you bring to the human race that this other person doesn't bring to the human race? Is it just an awareness of the importance of self-reliance, or does it go beyond that? Is there something, say, like the engineer down the street who isn't a prepper, but you know that they not only have the capability to help out your prepping group, but they also have the capability to make the world generally a better place? Maybe you know somebody who's very good-natured, caring person. There's many people of a variety of professions and dispositions who are not preppers, who arguably, from a philosophical or socio-political standpoint, should survive more than some people who call themselves preppers. You could argue that. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily true. You could also argue that part of survival of the fittest is that the naive understanding that you should rely on external forces like the government in order to protect you into perpetuity, no matter how bad conditions get, that should win you the Darwinian Olympics Award. And so even if you are one of the best engineers, if you don't think about preparedness, then you just won the Darwin Olympics. If you didn't prepare yourself for some major disaster and you died as a result of that, then it's, well, it's survival of the fittest. But you seldom see that overlap in society. You seldom see the so-called brightest minds within society with the highest IQs involved in emergency preparedness, or at least they're not very outspoken about it. Now, I'm going off on a wicked tangent here, but to get back to the point, these discussions we have about the social psychology of grid down survival are not just fantasy-based discussions. They have ramifications for how we understand our world. It's not just about understanding how SHTF is going to play out. It's about understanding human nature. And if anything, if we reverse engineer or reverse apply these concepts to the world as it is today, perhaps we can come to discover how the psyche of modern man, or human nature, will inevitably lead to a shit hits the fan situation. I did another video entitled After the Collapse Chaos Theory, which talks about the concept of entropy and how social systems are constantly in a state of breakdown and disarray, to a point where every civilization inevitably does collapse, but the question is when and why and how. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Go subscribe to the Prepper Logic channel as well. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.